Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Why does real intimacy make the divine masculine feel two opposite things at once? Why does the very thing that touches his soul also make him want to run? Because real intimacy does something casual connection never can. It does not just make him feel desired. It makes him feel seen. It makes him feel emotionally present. It makes him feel what he buried, what he feared, what he longed for, and what he has spent years trying to manage through silence, logic, distance, or control. And that is why it terrifies him. Not because intimacy is wrong, not because he feels nothing, but because real intimacy reaches past the mask. It exposes the tenderness beneath the armor, the longing beneath the control, the need beneath the pride, the soul beneath the old self. That is also why it awakens him, because what terrifies the old self often liberates the deeper self. So why does real intimacy shake him this deeply? Why can one moment of true closeness do more than months of distance? Why does he pull away after feeling more alive than he has in years? And why is intimacy often the very doorway through which divine masculine awakening begins? In this video, we are going deep into why real intimacy both terrifies and awakens the divine masculine, and why the same closeness that makes him want to hide is often the exact thing that starts bringing him back to his soul. Chapter 1: Why real intimacy is more than physical. Most people think intimacy is about closeness, physical closeness, romantic closeness, a moment between two people that feels intense, magnetic, unforgettable. But real intimacy is much deeper than that. And that is why it both terrifies and awakens the divine masculine. Because real intimacy is not just physical contact. It is emotional exposure, energetic truth, vulnerability without disguise. The kind of closeness that reaches past the surface and touches the hidden self. That is what makes it powerful. And that is what makes it dangerous to the old self. Because the divine masculine may know how to handle attraction. He may know how to manage chemistry, desire, emotional interest, even strong feelings to a certain degree. He may know how to stay composed, stay in control, stay somewhat protected while still participating in relationships or emotional experiences. But real intimacy is different. It does not stay at the level of attraction. It reveals. It reveals what lives underneath the calm, underneath the logic, underneath the self-control, underneath the version of him that knows how to function without fully showing how deeply he can be affected. That is why real intimacy is more than physical. Physicality can create sensation. Real intimacy creates truth. Physicality may awaken desire. Real intimacy awakens the buried self. Physicality can be experienced and then compartmentalized. Real intimacy follows him into silence, because what it touches is not temporary. This matters deeply when we talk about the divine masculine. Because for many men, especially those moving through awakening, the old identity is built around regulation, around keeping things manageable, around feeling enough to stay human, but not so much that the deeper emotional world takes over, around staying strong by remaining partially hidden. So when intimacy becomes real, it does not just make him feel close to someone else. It makes him feel close to himself. That is the part he is often least prepared for, because being close to himself means being close to what he buried, what he avoided, what he softened through distance, what he renamed as being fine, being practical, needing space, or not wanting too much. Real intimacy strips those labels. It says, no, there is more here. There is more in you. There is more truth in this moment than the old self knows how to comfortably hold. That is why the same intimacy that feels beautiful can also feel terrifying. Not because intimacy is wrong, because intimacy is honest. And honesty changes the field. A man can live a long time inside emotional partialness, inside roles, inside coping systems, inside a version of masculinity that looks steady but may actually be built on careful distance from vulnerability. He can call that maturity, independence, self-containment, strength. Then real intimacy happens, and suddenly, he feels seen in places he usually hides. He feels present in his own body in a different way. He feels tenderness he was not prepared to carry openly. He feels emotional immediacy. He feels how alive he is beneath the structures that once helped him survive. That is a very big moment. Because once a man has been touched there, the old life no longer feels exactly the same. This is why real intimacy is not just an event. It is a mirror that shows him what he wants, what he fears, what he has buried, what he has starved, what he has controlled, and what he can no longer fully keep asleep once it has been touched by truth. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because before we can understand why intimacy both terrifies and awakens him, we have to understand that the intimacy itself is not superficial. It is not just about closeness in the ordinary sense. It is about what closeness reveals. He may think he is reacting to desire, but often he is reacting to exposure. He may think he is responding to chemistry, but often he is responding to recognition. He may think the moment is intense because it feels good, but often it feels intense because it is stirring what the old self has worked very hard not to feel so directly. This is why real intimacy can shake the divine masculine more than months at distance ever could. Distance allows the mask to recover. Intimacy touches what is behind the mask. Distance allows him to think. Intimacy makes him feel in real time. Distance lets him return to old structure. Intimacy interrupts that structure and says, there is a truer self under here. That interruption is sacred, because real intimacy does not only connect him to another person, it reconnects him to the emotional reality of his own soul. That can feel wonderful, and overwhelming, and humbling, and destabilizing, all at once. Which is why so many divine masculines become contradictory after real intimacy. Because contradiction is often what happens when the soul is awakened before the old identity knows how to surrender. One part of him feels relief, resonance, truth, life. Another part feels threat, exposure, loss of control, emotional risk. That split is the beginning of the journey. Not because intimacy caused damage, because intimacy revealed the split that was already there. The split between the self who wants truth and the self who still survives through defense. The self who longs for closeness and the self who fears what closeness will expose. The self who knows sacred love is real and the self who still thinks safety means staying one step removed from it. That is why real intimacy matters so much in the divine masculine story. Because it forces the confrontation, not always with words, not always with immediate clarity, but energetically, emotionally, existentially. It says, here is what it feels like when your soul is touched. Now, what will you do with the self that still does not know how to hold that truth? That is the deeper question underneath everything. And it explains why physical intimacy without emotional truth may not awaken him in the same way. The body may respond, yes. Desire may be present, yes. But awakening begins when the moment reaches beyond desire and starts revealing deeper reality. When it touches not only attraction, but grief. Not only chemistry, but tenderness. Not only closeness, but recognition. That is when the old self starts trembling. Because now he cannot simply categorize the moment and move on. Now it has entered the deeper layers. The ones that hold memory, unmet need, fear of being seen, longing for safety, longing for home, longing for a version of masculinity that no longer has to stay so defended in order to feel strong. This is the hidden holiness of intimacy. It is not here merely to make him feel more. It is here to reveal what more actually means. more truth, more life, more emotional honesty, more soul, more self than the old life has been allowing him to inhabit consciously. That is why real intimacy is more than physical, because physicality can remain on the surface. Real intimacy changes the relationship a man has with himself. After real intimacy, he may still try to go back, still try to use logic, still try to regulate through distance, still try to convince himself he can return to the same emotional neutrality. But often, something has already changed. He now knows what deeper contact feels like. He now knows what it means to be reached. He now knows what it feels like when the body, heart, and soul all respond at once. That kind of knowing is difficult to erase, because it is not only in the mind, it is embodied. And embodied truth does not disappear just because the outer moment ends. It lingers, as memory, as contrast, as restlessness, as tenderness, as the beginning of a different kind of question. If this is what truth feels like, why have I been living so far from it? That is where awakening begins. Not with a perfect answer, with a disturbance, a holy disturbance. The kind that makes the old self less believable. The kind that makes the old peace feel less real. The kind that reveals that what he has called control may have also been a way of avoiding a deeper life. Maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. Real intimacy terrifies and awakens the divine masculine, because it is not only about being close to another person. It is about being unable to stay far from himself. And for a man who has spent years mastering distance from certain parts of his own heart, that kind of intimacy can feel like both danger and home in the same breath. That is why it shakes him. That is why it stays with him. And that is why one real moment of intimacy can begin a journey the old self will never fully be able to undo. Chapter 2: Intimacy makes him feel what he buried. The second truth is this. Real intimacy does not only make the divine masculine feel love, it makes him feel what he buried. That is why it terrifies him, and that is why it awakens him. Because when intimacy is real, it does not stop at the present moment. It reaches backward, into the places he thought were handled, into the pain he learned to outgrow by suppressing it, into the tenderness he buried because tenderness once felt too exposed, too risky, too unsafe to keep near the surface. This is where the experience becomes deeper than attraction. He may think he is only reacting to one person, one moment, one intense experience of closeness, but often, what he is really reacting to is everything that the moment unlocks inside him: the grief, the longing, the softness, the old unmet need, the fear of being seen, the part of him that still remembers what it feels like to want safety and not know if safety will last. That is why intimacy can feel so disproportionate, because it is not only happening now, it is awakening then. It is touching the younger parts of him, the wounded parts, the hidden parts, the parts he built an entire adult identity around: not needing too much, not showing too much, not trusting too much. The parts he taught himself to manage through silence, control, distance, distraction, or emotional restraint. Then intimacy happens, and what he buried starts moving. This is why a real moment of closeness can shake him more than months of surface connection ever could. Because surface connection stays above the wound, real intimacy reaches it. It stirs what has been sleeping beneath the old self. It wakes up the internal places where he has stored disappointment, unmet tenderness, fear of emotional dependency, fear of collapse, and the ache of not having been fully met before. That is a lot, and it does not rise neatly. It rises as intensity, as heaviness in the chest, as emotional pressure, as the strange ache of feeling both drawn and threatened at once, as confusion that seems too big for what just happened, as the sense that the moment means more than it should. But the moment is not the whole story. The moment is a doorway. What walks through that doorway is buried truth. This is why the divine masculine may feel overwhelmed after real intimacy, not because he is weak, not because intimacy is wrong, but because real closeness activates layers of emotional reality he was not consciously prepared to meet. It does not just make him feel connected, it makes him feel everything that connection touches in a soul that has been armored for years. This is especially painful because what gets buried is not only pain. It is hope. Hope for a kind of love that is safe. Hope that he can soften without losing himself. Hope that being seen does not always lead to shame. Hope that emotional truth does not have to end in instability or disappointment. Those hopes often get buried with the wounds. So when intimacy awakens him, it also awakens those old hopes. And hope can feel just as dangerous as pain to the old self, because to hope is to become vulnerable again, to want more than the old identity feels safe allowing, to sense that maybe something real is possible, and with that possibility comes risk. That is the terror, because what the old self buried was not random. It buried what once felt too costly to hold consciously. It built a life round functionality, round composure, round not needing too much from love, round staying just guarded enough that the hidden self could remain hidden. Real intimacy disrupts that arrangement. It says, no, you are not as detached as you thought. You are not as untouched as you wanted to believe. You are carrying far more than you let yourself admit. That realization is deeply unsettling, because now he is not only dealing with desire, he is dealing with exposure. Exposure to grief he never fully processed. Exposure to loneliness he normalized. Exposure to the buried tenderness beneath the armor. Exposure to the fact that the man he has become is still shaped by emotional truths he thought he left behind. This is why some divine masculines go quiet after intimacy. Not because it meant nothing, because it meant too much. It touched places without language. It activated a depth he does not yet know how to narrate. He may not be able to say, I'm feeling what I buried. More often, he just feels disrupted. He feels more emotional, more inward, more restless, more unable to return to his old neutrality. And that is the sign. Because buried things do not stay quiet once truth has touched them. They rise. The old pain rises. The old longing rises. The old fear of being truly known rises. The old need to control what he reveals rises. That can make him contradictory. One part of him wants more closeness because the buried self feels called into life. Another part wants distance because the old defense system is trying to rebury everything before it changes him too much. This is the sacred split intimacy exposes. The soul wants truth, but the old self still wants safety on its original terms. That is the war. And it begins here, with what he buried. This chapter matters because it explains why intimacy can feel like both medicine and threat. It is medicine because it reaches what has been emotionally starved. It is threat because it awakens what the old self worked very hard to keep outside of daily life. And once that awakening begins, he can no longer fully pretend the old identity is enough. Because now he knows. There is more in him. More pain, yes, but also more life, more tenderness, more desire for depth, more emotional truth than the old self can comfortably allow. That is what intimacy reveals. And maybe that is the deepest truth of all. Real intimacy terrifies and awakens the divine masculine because it makes him feel what he buried. And once buried truth becomes conscious, the old self can never again feel as solid, as convincing, or as safe as it did before. That is why he changes. Not because intimacy creates a new man out of nowhere, because it resurrects the man beneath the armor. And once that buried self begins waking up, everything the old self called peace starts being questioned. That is the beginning of awakening. Chapter 3 breaks the illusion of emotional control. The third truth is this. Real intimacy breaks the illusion of emotional control. That is why it terrifies the divine masculine. And that is why it awakens him. Because for many men, emotional control is not just a habit. It is identity. It is the system that helped him survive, the structure that helped him stay composed, the way he learned to function without collapsing into what he feels, the strategy that made him look strong, measured, rational, safe. So, for a long time, control feels like peace. If he stays calm, he feels protected. If he stays logical, he feels grounded. If he stays one step back, he feels like he can breathe. If he stays unreadable, he feels like nothing can truly undo him. But real intimacy changes that. Because intimacy does not ask the old self for permission. It reaches him anyway. It reaches him before the mind can organize the experience. It reaches him in the body, in the heart, in the nervous system. It bypasses the emotional management system and creates truth in real time. A truth that cannot be fully filtered through logic, performance, or distance. That is what breaks the illusion. He may still be able to control his words, his timing, his behavior on the surface. But suddenly, he realizes he cannot fully control what is happening inside him. He cannot control how deeply the moment touched him. He cannot control how often it returns in memory. He cannot control the tenderness that lingers afterward. He cannot control how his body remembers what his ego wants to reduce. That is destabilizing, because the old masculine self was never built to feel powerless inside real emotion. It was built to contain, regulate, minimize, survive. It trusted discipline, not surrender. It trusted restraint, not revelation. Then real intimacy happens. And what does it reveal? That he is not nearly as unaffected as he thought. That his composure has limits. That his distance has limits. That his logic has limits. That what is real can move him beyond what the old self knows how to control. This is one of the deepest shocks of awakening, because a man can tolerate pain if he still believes he is in charge of it. What shakes him is when he realizes the emotional truth is already inside him, already affecting him, already changing him before he has any satisfying explanation for why. That is when the illusion cracks. He starts noticing, I'm thinking about this more than I'm meant to. I feel different after being close to her. Silence is louder now. Distance is not bringing the same relief. I cannot just go back to the version of myself I was before. That is not weakness. That is the old control system failing to fully contain what the soul has recognized. This is why real intimacy can make him pull away afterward. Not because the intimacy failed, because it succeeded. It showed him that his emotional control is not absolute. It exposed how much of that control was really careful management, careful distance, careful self-protection. It revealed that beneath the disciplined exterior there is still a man who can be deeply moved, deeply reached, deeply changed. And that is beautiful and terrifying, because if intimacy can reach him this deeply, then the old self loses one of its favorite lies. I can handle this without changing. Real intimacy says, no, you are already changing. You are softer than you thought, more vulnerable than you thought, more reachable than you thought, more emotionally alive than the old identity ever wanted to admit. That is why the illusion of control breaks here, not because he becomes chaotic, because he becomes honest. He begins seeing that what he called control was often containment. What he called composure was sometimes suppression. What he called peace may have been the absence of enough truth to disturb the system. Now truth is present. Now the system is disturbed. And that disturbance is sacred. Because once the illusion of emotional control breaks, he has to face a deeper question. If I cannot control what this awakens in me, then what is this really showing me? That question begins awakening. It begins when a man stops seeing his emotional reaction as a problem to shut down and starts sensing that it may be a revelation of what matters, of what he buried, of how much the old self cannot carry forward into real love without being transformed. This is why chapter 3 matters so much. Because the divine masculine does not only fear intimacy because it makes him feel more. He fears it because it reveals that feeling is stronger than the old system he used to manage it. And that revelation changes everything. He may still resist, still go silent, still try to restore old control. But inwardly, something has already shifted. He knows now that he cannot fully dominate the truth once it has entered him. He knows that one real moment can bypass years of emotional discipline. He knows that the deeper self is not nearly as dead or distant as the old life suggested. That knowledge becomes the beginning of a different kind of masculinity, not one built on perfect control, one built on truth. And maybe that is the deepest truth of all. Real intimacy terrifies the divine masculine because it breaks the illusion that he is in full control of what touches his soul. But that same break is what awakens him. Because once the false control fails, the real self has a chance to come forward. And that is where the deeper journey begins. Chapter 4. He feels seen in places he usually hides. Real intimacy terrifies and awakens the divine masculine because it does something the old self is never fully prepared for. It makes him feel seen, not admired, not desired, not simply wanted, seen. And there is a difference. To be desired can still leave the mask intact. To be admired can still leave the role intact. To be wanted can still allow him to stay partially hidden behind the version of himself he knows how to control. But to be seen, that reaches deeper. It reaches the places he usually keeps private. The places beneath composure, beneath logic, beneath emotional self-control, beneath the identity that says, I am fine, I am steady, I do not need much, I do not reveal much. That is why real intimacy shakes him. Because once he feels seen in those hidden places, the old self can no longer fully rely on invisibility. And invisibility is one of its greatest protections. For many divine masculines, staying partly unreadable has been a survival skill. It may look like maturity, independence, emotional steadiness, but often it is also protection from exposure, protection from being known too deeply, protection from having to admit how much is actually inside him, protection from the fear that if someone truly saw the softer, more vulnerable, more uncertain parts of him, something would be lost: control, safety, dignity, identity. So he learns to manage this surface. He learns how much to reveal, how much to say, how much to hold back, how to look calm even when something deeper is moving underneath. Then real intimacy happens. And suddenly, he feels transparent. Not because the other person knows every fact about him, not because she solved him in some dramatic way, but because her presence reaches beneath what he intended to show. She feels the tenderness under the restraint, the longing under the distance, the contradiction under the silence, the ache beneath the control. And he knows she feels it. That is what changes everything. Because when the divine masculine feels seen in places he usually hides, two things happen at once. Part of him feels relief. Part of him feels danger. The relief comes from recognition. Some part of him has always wanted to be met there, wanted to stop performing so hard, wanted to feel known without having to over-explain himself into being understood, wanted someone to sense that there's more in him than the old self usually allows to the surface. That is the healing side of intimacy. But the danger comes from exposure. Because if someone can feel those hidden places, then the old self is no longer fully in charge of the image. It can no longer maintain the same illusion of emotional distance. It can no longer say, no one really sees how much this matters to me. Because now someone has already touched the place where it matters. That is deeply destabilizing. This is why real intimacy is not just about closeness. It is about visibility. And visibility is one of the old self's deepest fears. Not because being seen is inherently bad, because being seen makes truth harder to manage. A man can hide from many things while he remains unseen. He can hide from his own tenderness, hide from the depth of his longing, hide from how emotionally hungry he has been, hide from how much he still fears vulnerability, hide from how much of his life has been built around not having to let certain parts of himself come fully into the light. But once intimacy makes him feel seen, those hidden places begin waking up. That is why it both terrifies and awakens him. It terrifies him because now the deeper self is no longer invisible. It awakens him because what has been seen begins wanting to live. This is one of the most important truths of the divine masculine journey. He is not only afraid of closeness, he is afraid of what closeness reveals. He is not only afraid of love, he is afraid of being visible inside love, visible in his need, visible in his tenderness, visible in the places where he is not as detached, not as certain, not as emotionally invulnerable as he once believed. That can make him pull away, not because he feels nothing, because he feels too much of himself. This is where so many people misunderstand the masculine reaction. They see the withdrawal and think, maybe he did not really care. But often, the withdrawal happens because the care became visible, because the connection reached a level of emotional truth where he could no longer comfortably hide from how affected he was. Because once he felt seen, the old self began scrambling to restore privacy, control, and distance. But distance does not undo visibility. That is the problem. Once he has been seen at that level, even briefly, the hidden self does no longer fully alone. It knows it has been recognized. It knows someone touched the places he usually lives around rather than through. And because of that, the old self can never quite feel as sealed off as before. That is the awakening side. Because being seen does not only expose the wound, it exposes the soul. It reveals that the deeper man is still there, still feeling, still wanting, still responsive to truth, still longing for a form of connection where he does not have to remain fragmented in order to feel safe. That revelation is sacred. It is also a threat to the old identity, because the old identity survives through fragmentation, through keeping certain parts of him out of the room, the strong self in front, the vulnerable self in hiding, the composed self in public, the tender self buried, the one who looks calm in charge, while the one who stays silent in the background. Real intimacy disrupts that split. It brings the hidden man closer to the surface. And once the hidden man comes closer to the surface, the old self starts losing power. That is why chapter 4 matters so much. Because the divine masculine often changes not simply because intimacy felt good, but because intimacy made him visible to himself in a way he can no longer comfortably deny. He begins seeing that he has more tenderness than the old self respected, more longing than the old life could satisfy, more vulnerability than he wanted to admit, more need for truth than his defenses know how to honor. And once those things are seen, they cannot be fully pushed back in a shadow without consequence. That consequence is inner conflict. He may become quieter, more inward, more careful, more contradictory. Why? Because now he is trying to figure out what to do with the self that has been seen. Should he bury it again? Protect it harder? Pretend the moment did not matter that much? Or should he begin allowing the truth of that visibility to change him? That is the deeper choice real intimacy creates. And it is why being seen can feel even more intense than being loved. Because love can still be idealized. Visibility is immediate. It says, this is you. This is the part you keep hidden. This is what is actually alive underneath the armor. And once a man has felt that level of recognition, he cannot fully return to the old innocence. He cannot fully believe that his hidden self is inaccessible. He cannot fully pretend that no one can reach the places he thought were too protected, too buried, too private to be touched. That is why real intimacy both terrifies and awakens him. It terrifies the self that survives by staying unreadable. It awakens the self that has been waiting to be known. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. What he fears is not only that she sees him, it is that she sees the man beneath the old performance. And that man is more real, more tender, more alive than the old identity can comfortably carry. That is what shakes him. Because once he has been seen there, the life built around hiding begins feeling less like strength and more like exile. That is the beginning of awakening. And it starts the moment the divine masculine realizes that what intimacy has revealed is not weakness, but the part of him that can no longer survive in the dark without longing for the light. Chapter 5 Intimacy reveals that he wants more than he admits. One of the deepest reasons real intimacy terrifies and awakens the divine masculine is because it reveals something he may have spent years trying not to admit. He wants more. More than attraction, more than chemistry, more than physical closeness, more than the kind of connection that lets him stay mostly in control, mostly protected, mostly hidden behind the self he already knows how to be. That is what real intimacy exposes. And that is why it can shake him so hard. Because for a long time, the old self may have built a life around wanting less, or at least pretending to. Wanting less means needing less. Needing less means risking less. Risking less means staying safer from disappointment, shame, exposure, emotional dependency, and the terrifying possibility that if he lets himself truly want what his soul wants, the life he has built around control may no longer be enough. So he learns to simplify desire. He tells himself, I'm fine with this. I don't need too much. I'm better when things stay manageable. I don't want anything too deep. I just need peace, space, simplicity. And perhaps part of him believes that. But then real intimacy happens. And suddenly, the truth breaks through. He wants more. More tenderness. More truth. More emotional safety. More depth. More presence. More honesty than the old life knows how to comfortably allow. That revelation is destabilizing. Because the old self can tolerate attraction much more easily than it can tolerate deep want, attraction still lets him feel somewhat powerful. It can still live at the surface. It can still fit into the existing emotional structure. But when intimacy reveals that he wants something soul deep, something real enough to change him, that is no longer surface desire. That is hunger. And hunger is dangerous to the old self. Because once a man becomes conscious of his hunger, he can no longer fully pretend that emotional distance is enough. He can no longer keep calling numb peace if intimacy has shown him what real closeness feels like. He can no longer stay comfortable inside the old narrative that he is detached, self-contained, untouched, or fine with less. That is why this chapter matters so much. Real intimacy does not only show him what he feels for someone else, it shows him what he has been starving for. That may be the deepest truth of all. He may think the intensity is about her, and yes, partly it is. But often, what intensifies the experience is the fact that intimacy is revealing a hunger he has been managing, minimizing, or burying for years, a hunger to be met without performance. A hunger to soften without being punished for it. A hunger to be known in a way that reaches deeper than role, image, function, or controlled affection. A hunger for a life where he no longer has to split himself between what he shows and what he actually feels. That kind of hunger is not casual. And once it wakes up, it changes everything. Because now he is no longer just dealing with one connection. He is dealing with the collapse of the illusion that he needs as little as he once claimed. This is why real intimacy can be so terrifying. Not because it creates weakness, because it exposes desire. Desire for more emotional truth than he has allowed. desire for more spiritual closeness than he thought was safe, desire for more tenderness than the old masculine identity was comfortable respecting, and desire at that level forces a reckoning. What if I am not as detached as I thought? What if I do need more than I've admitted? What if the life I built around control is actually too small for what my soul wants? What if the peace I've been protecting is not peace at all, but the absence of enough truth to disrupt me? These are painful questions, because once they arrive, the old self begins losing innocence. The old self says, less is safer. Do not want too much. Do not let one connection become too meaningful. Do not let your heart outrun your defenses. But intimacy says, it already did. That is the real disturbance. He realizes he is not only enjoying closeness, he is recognizing need. Not needy in the shallow sense. Human, the need to be met. The need to feel safe enough to exhale. The need to stop performing emotional distance as strength. The need to stop living in such careful internal exile from the deeper parts of himself. This is why the divine masculine may become more conflicted after real intimacy, not less. Because wanting more changes the stakes. If he wants more, then he can no longer stay fully loyal to the old identity that taught him to want less. If he wants more, then the old explanation starts sounding thin. If he wants more, then the silence, the distance, the control, the emotional have-presence all begin feeling more costly than before. That cost becomes part of the awakening. He may start noticing. Ordinary life feels flatter now. Surface interactions feel less nourishing. The old peace feels less alive. The old self feels less convincing. Why? Because intimacy gave him contrast. Contrast between being merely functional and being deeply met. Contrast between emotional management and emotional truth. Contrast between staying safe in the old way and feeling alive in a new way. That contrast is hard to ignore once it has been felt. And maybe that is why he pulls away sometimes. Not because he wants less, because he now knows he wants more. And more is far more dangerous to the old self than less ever was. More means more exposure, more vulnerability, more truth, more possibility of being changed, more collapse of the carefully managed self who knew how to survive without needing too much from love. That is terrifying, because if he admits he wants more, he must also face the possibility that the old life cannot satisfy him anymore. That the old masculinity built around restraint and distance cannot carry him all the way into what his soul is actually longing for. That is a huge identity shift. And it often begins here, not with clarity, with hunger. The hunger to be known, to be safe, to be whole, to stop reducing the heart to something manageable just because the old self fears what the full truth will require. This is why real intimacy awakens him, because it does not just give him an experience. It gives him a taste of what is possible. And once a man has tasted what is possible, fine stops being enough in the same way. That is the sacred disturbance. He now knows more is real, more depth, more peace, more truth, more tenderness, more of himself. That knowledge becomes irreversible, because once intimacy reveals what he wants more than he admits, he can still delay, still resist, still try to return to the old emotional structure, but he cannot fully unknow the hunger, and hunger changes a man. It makes him question the old life, question the old peace, question the old self who insisted that needing less was strength. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. Real intimacy terrifies the divine masculine because it reveals that he wants more than he admits. And once he knows that, he can no longer comfortably keep living as though less is enough. That is why he changes. Not only because someone touched him, because intimacy showed him the size of his own heart. And once a man sees the size of his own heart, the old life begins feeling smaller. That is the fear. And that is the awakening. Chapter 6: Why the Old Self Interprets Intimacy as Danger. If real intimacy is so healing, why does the old self react to it like a threat? That is the question at the heart of this chapter. Because the divine masculine is not only dealing with love when intimacy becomes real, he is dealing with conditioning. And conditioning often translates truth into danger. That is why intimacy can feel so contradictory. One part of him feels relief, resonance, soul recognition, the sense of finally being touched in a way that goes beyond surface attraction. Another part tightens, pulls back, goes quiet, wants space, wants distance, wants to regain control before the emotional truth goes any deeper. Why? Because the old self has learned something very specific. Vulnerability is risky. Maybe not in those exact words. Maybe not consciously. But somewhere along the way, many men learn that being open can lead to pain, that being emotionally visible can lead to shame, that wanting too much can make them weak, that softness can be misunderstood, that closeness can become instability, that being deeply affected can cost them the very identity they built to survive. So the old self adapts. It chooses control over surrender, distance over exposure, silence over emotional risk, composure over transparency. And over time, these are no longer just strategies. They become a self, the self who does not reveal too much, the self who can always step back, the self who remains difficult to read, the self who believes that staying one step removed is wiser than letting anything touch him too deeply. Then real intimacy enters, and the old system panics, not because intimacy is actually unsafe, because intimacy touches exactly what the old self has spent years trying to keep protected. This is why the old self interprets intimacy as danger, not because intimacy is inherently dangerous, because intimacy exposes the deeper self, and the deeper self has no armor. It feels, it longs, it remembers, it wants, it aches, it knows. That is beautiful to the soul. It is terrifying to the old identity, because if the deeper self comes too far forward, then the old structure begins losing power. The one built around control, certainty, and emotional management starts cracking. And to the old self, that crack feels like loss of safety. This is one of the most important things to understand about divine masculine awakening. The old self does not fear intimacy because it feels nothing. It fears intimacy because it feels too much. It feels the possibility of being seen, the possibility of needing, the possibility of not being able to go back to the same emotional numbness, the possibility that what he once called peace was really only distance from himself. That is why real intimacy can trigger fear even when the soul recognizes truth. The soul says, "This is real. This is what you have been longing for. This is what makes you feel alive." The old self says, "Too much, too risky, too exposing. You will lose control if you stay here." That is the conflict. And this conflict is not random. It usually has roots. The old self formed for reasons. Maybe tenderness was not safe when he was younger. Maybe emotional expression was not honored. Maybe closeness came with disappointment, unpredictability, abandonment, or shame. Maybe he learned that to survive, he needed to stay composed, self-contained, less needy, less visible. Maybe he learned that the parts of him that wanted closeness had to be hidden in order for the rest of him to keep functioning. That learning shapes the nervous system. So now, when intimacy becomes real, it is not only a spiritual event, it is a nervous system event. His body may register closeness as both comfort and threat. His heart may feel relief while his old defenses launch into action. He may want to stay and immediately feel the urge to pull back. He may feel safer in the intimacy itself than in the meaning of what the intimacy is asking him to face. This is why the fear can be so confusing, because the moment may feel peaceful. The aftermath may feel like panic. The closeness may feel sacred. The reality of what it means may feel destabilizing. He may think, why am I afraid if this feels so true? Why do I want to run from what also feels like home? Why does something this beautiful make me feel so exposed? Because the old self does not measure danger by truth. It measures danger by change. And intimacy demands change. Not always outwardly right away, but inwardly, yes. It asks him to stop hiding behind the same defenses. It asks him to stop treating emotional distance like strength. It asks him to become someone who can tolerate being seen, touched, affected, and changed without automatically retreating into the old shell. That is a lot to ask of a self built around protection, which is why it reacts as if something dangerous is happening. In a way, from its perspective, something is. Its control is being threatened. Its identity is being threatened. Its way of staying emotionally organized is being threatened. But threatened is not the same as harmed. That distinction matters, because the old self often cannot tell the difference between I am unsafe and I am being opened. That is the tragedy of unhealed conditioning. The body and ego interpret transformation as danger, and so real intimacy becomes frightening not because it is false, but because it is true enough to destabilize what was false. That is why intimacy awakens him, because it reveals the exact place where fear has been masquerading as wisdom. It reveals where he still associates vulnerability with shame, where he still confuses control with peace, where he still believes distance is safer than being known, where the old self would rather lose intimacy than lose its own familiar structure. This revelation is painful because it means he starts seeing that much of what he called maturity may have also been defense. Much of what he called caution may have been fear. Much of what he called emotional discipline may have been a refined way of staying disconnected from the deeper parts of himself. That is not easy to admit, but it is holy to see, because once a man starts seeing that, the old self begins losing its innocence. It can no longer fully say, this is just how I am. Now, there's another possibility. What if how I am is how I had to become, but not who I truly am? That question marks the beginning of awakening, because now he is not just feeling intimacy. He is questioning identity. He is asking, who am I without the armor? Who am I if I stop translating tenderness into danger? Who am I if I let truth touch me without running? Who am I if the real threat is not intimacy, but staying locked inside the old self forever? These are profound questions, and they are what intimacy forces. This is why Chapter 6 is so important. The old self interprets intimacy as danger because intimacy brings him right to the threshold of becoming, and becoming is rarely comfortable to the identity that survived by staying the same. The old self would rather preserve itself than risk the unknown tenderness of a truer life. But the soul does not want mere preservation. It wants life, wholeness, truth, love without emotional exile. That is what intimacy is calling him toward. And that is why the fear is so intense. Not because intimacy is the problem, because intimacy reveals what the old self cannot carry forward without transforming. Maybe that is the deepest truth of all. Real intimacy terrifies the divine masculine because the old self confuses being opened with being endangered. But what the old self calls danger, the soul often recognizes as the doorway back to what is real. That is why the same intimacy that scares him also awakens him, because it does not merely offer closeness. It offers the end of the life built around avoiding it. And once the offer has been felt, even if he resists it for a while, he can never fully unknow what it revealed. That the greatest threat may not be intimacy itself, but the prison of the self that is too frightened to receive it. Chapter 7: Why he pulls away after real intimacy. If real intimacy awakens him, why does he pull away? Why does the divine masculine sometimes feel more alive, more open, more emotionally touched than he has in years, and then suddenly go quiet, distant, guarded, or hard to reach. Because what opens him most deeply also threatens the old self most intensely. That is the truth. Real intimacy does not only make him feel close, it makes him feel exposed. It makes him feel seen. It makes him feel what he buried. It breaks the illusion that he is in control. It reveals that he wants more than he admits. It brings the deeper self forward while the old identity is still trying to survive. That is a lot for one moment of closeness to carry. So when the intensity passes and the old self regains just enough space to react, it often does what it has always done when something gets too real. It pulls away, not because nothing happened, because too much happened. This is one of the most painful paradoxes of the divine masculine journey. From the outside, the retreat can feel confusing, even cruel. The connection felt real. The tenderness was there. The openness was there. Something honest came through. And then, right after, the masculine seems to move backward. Why? Because the old self interprets real intimacy as a threshold. And thresholds are dangerous to identities built on control. Before the intimacy became real, he may still have had room to think in abstraction. He could feel attraction without fully changing. He could feel interest without fully exposing the hidden self. He could stay in possibility, intention, and the idea of the connection rather than the lived truth of it. But once intimacy becomes real, the stakes change. Now he is not just imagining closeness. Now he has felt it, not just mentally, in the body, in the nervous system, in the soul. And the moment he feels it that deeply, the old self realizes something terrifying. I cannot stay the same if I let this continue. That is why he pulls away. Because pulling away is often the old self's attempt to restore identity. It wants to regain emotional control, regain composure, regain predictability, regain the version of him that feels less vulnerable, less visible, less dependent on something so true. He may tell himself he just needs space, time, clarity, less pressure, and maybe part of him believes that. But beneath those explanations is often a much deeper movement. He is trying to recover from revelation of how much he feels, revelation of how much the moment reached him, revelation of how little the old defenses protected him from something real. That is why retreat often comes right after the most genuine closeness. Because the intimacy succeeded. It reached the part of him that is still human beneath the armor. And the old self does not know how to let that happen without trying, almost immediately, to re-establish distance. This is especially true because real intimacy creates aftershock. The moment itself may feel warm, peaceful, sacred, undeniable. But afterward, what it awakened remains, the tenderness remains, the memory remains, the visibility remains, the deeper hunger remains. The old self starts realizing that the truth will not simply vanish when the moment ends. That can create panic. Not always visible panic. Sometimes quiet panic. The kind that looks like withdrawal, silence, being harder to read, becoming busy, needing to think, trying to return to normal. But normal has already changed. That is the deeper problem. Because once real intimacy has touched him, he can physically step back. But he cannot fully go back inwardly to who he was before. He now carries contrast. Contrast between the old life and what he felt in that moment, between emotional management and real emotional aliveness, between the old self and the deeper self-intimacy brought to the surface. That contrast makes retreat painful too. Because even while he pulls away, part of him knows exactly what he is pulling away from. Not only her, from himself, from the self that felt softer, more honest, more alive, more visible, more real than the old identity usually allows. That is why the retreat often does not bring peace. It brings temporary distance. but not peace. Distance may reduce the immediate intensity, but it cannot erase the imprint. So he ends up in a painful in-between. Too awakened to feel fully comfortable in the old self. Too afraid to fully surrender to the new one. That is why he becomes contradictory. One part of him wants the intimacy again. Another part fears what it will continue revealing. One part of him longs for the closeness. Another part is terrified of what closeness demands from his identity. One part feels the connection as home. Another part feels as the death of the familiar self. That contradiction is the real reason he pulls away. Not because intimacy was false, because intimacy was true enough to threaten the structure of who he has been. This deserves to be understood clearly. Pulling away does not make the intimacy meaningless. It often proves the opposite, because people do not usually retreat this hard from what did not reach them. They retreat from what got through, from what bypassed the defenses, from what exposed the ache, from what made the old life feel smaller afterward, from what made them feel more emotionally alive than they know how to live with yet. That is what real intimacy does. And that is why the divine masculine may seem to run right after the thing he most deeply wanted. Because wanting and holding are not the same stage of awakening. He may want the truth, but holding the truth requires a different self than the one who has survived through hiding. That self is not fully built yet. So he pulls away, not because love is absent, because capacity is incomplete. That is the sacred pain of this chapter. The retreat is often not the end of the story. It is the old self buying time. Time to process what was awakened. Time to wrestle with the loss of control. Time to grieve the identity that real intimacy is exposing as too small. Time to feel, even in silence, that the old ways of staying safe are no longer enough to make him feel whole. This is why many divine masculines come back inwardly before they come back outwardly. The retreat does not erase the truth. It often intensifies it, because now he is alone with the memory, the contrast, the aftershock, the evidence that something real has already happened inside him. He may be trying to recover the old self, but the old self no longer feels as solid. That is the beginning of awakening. Maybe that is the deepest truth of all. He pulls away after real intimacy not because the intimacy failed, but because it succeeded in bringing him face to face with the self he can no longer keep hidden. That is what terrifies him, and that is also what awakens him, because every retreat that fails to bring real peace eventually teaches him something. The danger was never intimacy itself. The danger to the old self was truth. And once truth has been felt that deeply, the masculine can delay, resist, or step back for a while. But he cannot fully return to emotional sleep in the same way again. That is why this chapter matters. Because the pull away is not always proof of disconnection. Sometimes it is proof that something sacred got through. And once it got through, the old self had no choice but to react. That reaction is fear. But underneath the fear, something else has already begun. The slow, painful, holy awakening of a man who now knows what real intimacy feels like, and can never again pretend that the life without it is enough. Chapter 8 Signs Real Intimacy has triggered awakening. How do you know real intimacy has done more than touch him for a moment? How do you know it has actually triggered awakening? Not fantasy, not projection, not wishful thinking. What are the real signs? Because intimacy can feel intense without changing a man. Attraction can be powerful without awakening the soul. A moment can be beautiful without dismantling the old self. So the question matters. How do you know the divine masculine has not only felt intimacy, but has been changed by it? The answer is this. You know because the old self stops feeling as stable, as convincing, and as peaceful to him as it did before. That is the real sign. Not instant perfection, not instant confession, not instant clarity, but inner destabilization of what used to keep him emotionally asleep. That is where awakening begins. And there are signs, real signs, often quiet first, often confusing before they become obvious, often more internal than verbal. The first sign is this. 1. He becomes quieter and more inward. This is one of the clearest signs that real intimacy has triggered something deeper. He becomes quieter, not because he feels less, because he feels more than he can immediately explain. Something in him is processing beyond language. The moment of intimacy did not stay in the moment, it kept unfolding inwardly. He may become more reflective, more private, more emotionally internal, because part of him is trying to understand why one experience of closeness affected him more than the old self knows how to handle. This quiet is not always peace. Sometimes it is sacred disruption. 2. He cannot stop replaying the feeling. Not always the details. Often the feeling. How it felt to be close. How it felt to be seen. How it felt to soften. How it felt when the old control loosened and something more human, more tender, more real came through. This matters because when intimacy triggers awakening, it leaves an imprint. He may replay the energy, the tone, the emotional atmosphere, the specific sense of truth in the moment. He is not only remembering a person, he is returning to the state intimacy awakened inside him. And that state is hard to forget once it has been felt. 3. Distance no longer brings the same peace. Before real intimacy, distance may still have helped him regulate. He could step back, go quiet, return to routine, and feel as though he had restored order. After real intimacy changes him, distance behaves differently. He may still choose it, still reach for it, but it does not soothe the same way. Now distance feels heavier, emptier, more revealing, because he is no longer merely escaping another person. He is sitting with the contrast between what he felt in intimacy and what the old self can give him in separation. That contrast makes distance feel less like peace and more like interruption. That is a major sign. 4. He feels restless without fully understanding why. Restlessness is often one of the strongest signs that intimacy has triggered awakening. He may feel off, unsettled, unable to return fully to the old emotional rhythm, more mentally occupied, more internally stirred. Why? Because intimacy showed him something real. It revealed more life, more feeling, more truth than his normal coping system was prepared to integrate quickly. So now the system is under pressure. The old habits no longer fit as comfortably, but the new self is not yet fully stable either. That in between creates restlessness. 5. He starts questioning the old self. This is where awakening becomes unmistakable. Before intimacy, he may have trusted the old identity, the calm one, the controlled one, the one who stays composed, the one who does not need too much, the one who can always step back. After real intimacy reaches him, that identity starts cracking. He begins asking, why do I pull away when something matters? Why does closeness make me feel both alive and afraid? Why does the old distance feel less convincing now? Why do I keep trying to return to a version of myself that no longer feels fully true? These are awakening questions. Because now he is not only reacting to the connection, he is reflecting on himself. 6. He feels more exposed to his own emotions. Real intimacy often leaves him more emotionally visible to himself. He may feel more tenderness than usual, more sadness, more longing, more awareness of what he wants and fears. This does not always make him expressive outwardly. In fact, sometimes it makes him more silent, but inwardly, the emotional field becomes harder to ignore. He cannot fully maintain the same emotional distance from his own heart. That is a huge sign, because awakening often begins not when he suddenly talks more, but when he can no longer fully hide from what he feels. 7. He starts feeling the cost of his defenses. Before awakening, defenses still feel wise, necessary, protective. After real intimacy triggers something deeper, those same defenses begin feeling expensive. Silence feels heavier. Distance feels lonelier. Control feels exhausting. Restraint feels less noble and more like self-denial. This is one of the most important signs of all. Because the old self only remains powerful while it still seems helpful. Once it begins feeling costly, awakening accelerates. He starts seeing that what he once called strength may also have been emotional exile. That realization changes everything. 8. He feels changed but cannot fully explain the change. This is very common. He knows something is different. He knows the intimacy did something. He knows the old life feels different afterward, but he may not have clean language for it. He may call it intensity, complication, pressure, confusion, overwhelm, but underneath those labels is one deeper truth. He has been changed by contact with something real. This inability to fully explain the change is itself a sign of awakening, because it means the experience has gone deeper than ordinary mental interpretation. The soul has moved before the mind has caught up. 9. He becomes more aware of what he truly wants. Real intimacy reveals desire at a deeper level. Not just desire for closeness in the moment, desire for truth, for emotional safety, for tenderness, for being met, for a life that feels more alive than the old routine of emotional self-protection. Once that desire becomes conscious, he cannot fully unknow it. He may resist it, minimize it, step away from it, but it keeps working on him, because now he knows he wants more than the old self can comfortably provide. That is a powerful sign of awakening. 10. He cannot fully go back to who he was before. This is the deepest sign of all. Even if the outer situation becomes quiet, even if he retreats, even if he resists, even if time passes, something in him is not the same. The old emotional neutrality is gone. The old confidence in distance is weaker. The old self has lost some of its innocence. He now knows what real intimacy felt like. He now knows he is more reachable, more tender, more so responsive than the old identity wanted to believe. He now knows that closeness touched him in a way he cannot fully erase. That is awakening, not because he has solved everything, because he can no longer comfortably remain who he was before truth reached him. These are the signs, not flashy signs, not always obvious signs, but true signs. He becomes quieter and more inward. He replays the feeling. Distance stops bringing peace. Restlessness grows. The old self gets questioned. His emotions feel more visible. His defenses start feeling costly. He knows he is changed, even without full words. He becomes more aware of what he wants, and he cannot fully go back. That is how you know real intimacy has triggered awakening. Because it does not only give him a beautiful experience, it gives him a different relationship to himself. And perhaps that is the most important truth of all. When intimacy truly awakens the divine masculine, the biggest sign is not that he suddenly becomes easy to understand. It is that the old self becomes harder for him to live inside without feeling the split. That is the disturbance. That is the sign. And that is why real intimacy can both terrify and awaken him at the same time. Chapter 9: Why awakening through intimacy often begins in confusion. One of the hardest truths about divine masculine awakening is this. It often begins in confusion, not clarity, not certainty, not immediate understanding. Confusion. And that is especially true when intimacy is the trigger. Because real intimacy reaches him before he has language for what it has done. It touches the nervous system before the mind can organize it. It awakens the soul before the old self knows how to explain why everything suddenly feels different. So what does he feel first? Contradiction. He feels more alive and more afraid. more connected and more exposed, more drawn and more inclined to pull away, more aware that something sacred happened and less able to calmly describe what that sacredness means. That is confusion. Not because nothing real happened, because something to real happened for the old self to process smoothly. This is one of the deepest reasons intimacy trigger awakening can look so messy from the outside. People imagine awakening should begin with a man finally understanding what he feels, finally admitting the truth, finally moving toward clarity. But often, the first stage is much more disorienting than that. He may think, why am I reacting like this? Why does this feel bigger than the moment itself? Why do I want closeness and distance at the same time? Why does something that felt so peaceful now make me feel unsettled? Why can't I just move on if the moment is over? These are real questions. And they come because the old map is failing. That is the key. Before real intimacy, he may have had a map for his emotional life, a map built around composure, self-containment, logic, space, and control. A map that let him manage attraction, connection, and even pain within the familiar limits of the self he had learned to be. Then real intimacy happens. And suddenly, the old map does not work. Because now he is not just dealing with emotion. He is dealing with revelation. Revelation of what he buried. Revelation of how much he actually wants. Revelation of how deeply he can be affected. Revelation of how incomplete the old self feels once something true has touched him. That kind of revelation does not arrive neatly. It arrives as emotional noise at first, not false noise. Sacred noise. The soul is speaking. The old self is panicking. The nervous system is trying to interpret closeness and exposure at the same time. The mind is trying to explain an experience that has already gone deeper than thought. So he becomes confused. And maybe that is the most compassionate way to understand this stage. He is confused because intimacy touched something deeper than his normal ways of understanding can immediately hold. He may try to reduce it, call it intensity, timing, pressure, overwhelm, complication. But underneath those words is a deeper truth. The self he has been is no longer enough to explain what his soul has just felt. That is why confusion comes first. Because the old self still wants a simple story. Something manageable. Something familiar. Something that lets him regain control and return to normal. But there is no true return to normal once real intimacy has awakened him. There is only the struggle between what he felt and who he has been. That struggle is confusing. One part of him feels the beauty of the intimacy. Another part feels the danger of what the intimacy revealed. One part of him wants to stay close to the truth. Another part wants to restore the old distance. One part feels home. Another part feels the death of the old emotional identity. That is why awakening through intimacy often begins in contradiction rather than certainty. And contradiction hurts, because he cannot fully go back. But he also does not yet know how to move forward. He is in between selves. The old self is still active. The deeper self is now awake. That in between is rarely graceful. It can look like silence, like withdrawal, like emotional inconsistency, like overthinking, like needing time for reasons he cannot fully explain. But beneath all of that, something important is happening. He is losing faith in the old emotional structure. That is why confusion is sacred here. Because confusion means he can no longer easily rely on the old assumptions. The old assumption that he is unaffected. The old assumption that distance equals peace. The old assumption that wanting less is safer. The old assumption that he can feel truth and remain unchanged by it. Now those assumptions are breaking. And the breaking creates fog before it creates clarity. That is normal. Because clarity usually comes after confrontation, after he begins seeing what intimacy actually revealed. after he starts recognizing that the pressure he feels is not random, but the result of being touched in places he has long kept hidden. Until then, confusion is often the first honest sign that awakening is underway. He cannot explain it because it has gone deeper than explanation. The body knows. The heart knows. The soul knows. The mind is late. And because the mind is late, he may misread himself for a while. He may think the fear means the connection is wrong. He may think the overwhelm means he should shut everything down. He may think the contradiction means nothing meaningful is happening, because if something meaningful were happening, shouldn't it feel clearer than this? Not necessarily. Sometimes sacred things arrive first as disruption, because disruption is what happens when truth enters a system built around hiding from it. That is exactly what intimacy does to the old self. It disrupts. It interrupts the identity, interrupts the routines, interrupts the old emotional narrative. And anything that interrupts identity this deeply is going to create confusion before it creates peace. This is why it is so important not to misjudge this stage. Confusion does not mean there is no soul contact. It may mean there is soul contact without integration yet. Confusion does not mean he feels nothing. It may mean he feels too much at once. Confusion does not mean intimacy failed to awaken him. It may mean awakening has started, but the old self is still trying to survive inside the process. That is the more honest view, because once you understand that, his behavior starts making more sense. The quiet, the retreat, the need to step back, the inability to explain what changed, the emotional contradiction, all of that can be part of the early awakening phase, not because he is insincere, but because the self that would live truthfully inside with intimacy revealed is not yet fully stable. So he wavers between old and new, between fear and longing, between the instinct to protect and the deeper call to become real. That wavering is confusion, but it is not meaningless. It is the bridge between being emotionally asleep and becoming emotionally honest. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. Awakening through intimacy often begins in confusion because intimacy does not first ask him to understand. It asks him to feel. And for a man who has survived by staying one step away from feeling too much too directly, that first wave of truth is rarely tidy. It is humbling, overwhelming, revealing, messy, but holy. Because the confusion means one thing above all. The old self no longer knows how to fully contain what the soul has recognized. And once that happens, awakening is no longer a distant possibility. It has already begun. Chapter 10: The deeper meaning of why intimacy both terrifies and awakens him. So why does real intimacy both terrify and awaken the divine masculine? Because real intimacy does not just bring him closer to someone else. It brings him closer to himself. That is the deeper meaning. And for a man who has spent years surviving through distance from certain parts of his own heart, that kind of closeness can feel like both home and danger at the same time. Home, because the soul recognizes truth. Danger, because the old self recognizes change. That is the paradox. Real intimacy is not frightening because it is false. It is frightening because it is real enough to undo what is false. It undoes the illusion that he is unaffected. It undoes the illusion that control is peace. It undoes the illusion that distance protects him from what matters. It undoes the illusion that wanting less is strength. And once those illusions begin breaking, the divine masculine cannot fully remain who he was before. That is what awakening is. Not a perfect spiritual mood. Not a neat realization. Not an instant transformation. A breaking, a holy breaking of the identity that could once survive by hiding from what the soul was longing to feel. This is why intimacy can terrify him, because the old self knows exactly what is at stake. If he lets this be real, then he cannot keep living from the same defenses. If he lets this truth in, then silence no longer feels innocent. If he allows himself to fully feel, then the life built around emotional control begins losing its authority. That is why he pulls away. That is why he goes quiet. That is why he gets confused. Not because intimacy means nothing, because intimacy means enough to change the structure of his inner world. And yet that same intimacy awakens him. Why? Because what terrifies the old self often liberates the deeper self. The deeper self has been waiting beneath the armor, waiting beneath the restraint, waiting beneath the distance, the pride, the silence, the carefully managed emotional life, waiting for something real enough to call it forward. Real intimacy does that. It awakens tenderness. It awakens buried truth. It awakens conscience. It awakens longing. It awakens the realization that the old self may have kept him safe in one way, but it also kept him far from the life his soul actually wants. That is the sacred gift hidden inside the fear, because intimacy is not here to destroy him. It is here to reveal him, to reveal the man beneath the defense, the man beneath the control, the man beneath the emotional exile, the man who still knows how to love, how to soften, how to be moved, how to feel something deeper than the old life allowed. And once that man has been touched, the journey changes forever. He may still resist, still hesitate, still take time, but inwardly, the old certainty is gone. Now he knows. He can be reached. He can be seen. He can be changed. He can no longer fully pretend that distance is enough. That is why intimacy both terrifies and awakens him. It terrifies the identity built around not needing too much. It awakens the soul that has always wanted more truth than the old self could admit. It terrifies the part that wants control. It awakens the part that wants wholeness. It terrifies the mask. It awakens the man. That is the deeper meaning of everything we explored. The silence, the retreat, the contradiction, the confusion, the aftershock, the longing. None of it means the intimacy failed. Often, it means the intimacy succeeded in reaching a level where the old self can no longer stay comfortable. And when the old self loses comfort, awakening begins. Not because pain is the goal, but because pain exposes where truth is being resisted. This is why some of the most life-changing awakenings begin not in peace, but in disruption, not because the path is wrong, but because truth entered a system built around avoiding it. Real intimacy shakes him, because it asks him to become someone who no longer needs the same distance in order to feel safe. That is a huge transformation, and it rarely happens all at once. But once intimacy has shown him what is real, the old life becomes harder to believe in, harder to worship, harder to call enough with the same innocence. That is how awakening grows. Slowly sometimes, painfully often, but truly, because the soul does not forget being touched. And maybe that is the deepest truth of all. Real intimacy terrifies the divine masculine because it reveals the exact place where the old self must end. But it awakens him because beyond the ending is the beginning of a truer masculine life. A life where strength is no longer built on emotional absence. A life where love no longer has to fight so hard to reach him. A life where truth becomes more sacred than hiding. A life where the heart is no longer treated like a threat just because it is alive. That is the invitation, not perfection. Truth, not instant clarity. Realness, not a polished spiritual performance. A man becoming honest enough to stop running from what his soul has already recognized. That is why intimacy matters so much. Because sometimes the very thing that scares him most is the doorway back to everything real in him. So, if this message found you at the right time, let this be your reminder. Not every retreat means love is absent. Not every silence means nothing happened. Not every fear means the connection is wrong. Sometimes fear appears because something true has finally reached the place that has been hidden the longest. Sometimes real intimacy does not break him. It breaks what was keeping him from himself. And sometimes the moment that makes him want to run is the very moment his soul begins waking up. If this resonated with you, comment below. Real intimacy awakens the truth. And tell me, have you ever seen one moment of real intimacy change someone from the inside out? Your story may be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Subscribe for more divine masculine, twin flame, and spiritual psychology content.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.